Okay, we are live, and I want to welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donnie, and we at Standing for Truth are dedicated to defending the truth of biblical creation. We also host debates, interviews, lectures, and more. And so if you enjoy this content, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. And please share around this content, as the truth is so incredibly important. Now, one of the many ways we defend the truth of biblical creation is by inviting and hosting some really awesome guests on the program here. And today it is an honor and a privilege to have Dr. Jerry Bergman here once again with me for another important show. Jerry was here last month for a presentation and discussion on human evolution, specifically apes as ancestors. This was a comprehensive program. Therefore, anybody who has not yet seen it, please check it out. We touched on so many important topics: the hominid fossil record, Lucy, pseudogenes, endogenous retroviruses, chromosome 2 fusion, and more. Dr. Bergman, thank you so much again for giving us your time for this important show. Now, before we get into the presentation for this evening, I do want to give our guest a brief introduction, and then we're just going to get right into his PowerPoint presentation, and then we're also going to make this interactive like we did last time. So guys in the audience, if you have questions, please make sure you're tagging me. I've already got some questions here in the side, so just make sure you're tagging me at Standing for Truth, and that way I won't miss them. Okay, so our guest, Dr. Jerry Bergman, has taught biology, genetics, chemistry, biochemistry, anthropology, geology, and microbiology for over 40 years at several colleges and universities, including Bowling Green State University, Medical College of Ohio, where he was a research associate in experimental pathology, and the University of Toledo. He is a graduate of the Medical College of Ohio, Wayne State University in Detroit, the University of Toledo, and Bowling Green State University. He has over 1,300 publications in 12 languages and 40 books and monographs. His books and textbooks that include chapters that he authored are in over 1,500 college libraries in 27 countries. So far, over 80,000 copies of the 40 books and monographs that he has authored or co-authored are in print. Also, I've got various links in the description box where you can find more about Dr. Bergman, including his many must-read articles that he has written. One specific book that I have behind me that I highly recommend is Fossil Forensics. Okay, that being said, Dr. Bergman, I want to hand it over to you, and we can kind of just get right into the show and the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be here. Let me get the slides up. Okay, you can see them?
Yes, looks great.
And I should mention, by the way, this is all now standard. There's nothing controversial whatsoever about this presentation. This is among those who are aware of this issue and includes National Geographic. Of course, National Geographic says it, so it must be true. I'm being a little bit facetious there, but I will show you that in a minute. And Neanderthals, they were for a century an evolutionary link between apes and us. And now, guess what? We have now shown beyond any question to anyone who has some knowledge about this that they are our brothers. This is a picture by a great French anthropologist, Boule, and he depicted Neanderthal man as you can see in this picture. And this is the picture which has been produced throughout the world in many textbooks and so on. Very ape-like, obviously, very stooped, hairy, short man. And this, by the way, now this surprises me because it is the 1996 children's book, and they still picture Neanderthals as primitive ape-like men. And this surprised me because, come on, by this time it was very clearly confirmed that Neanderthals are not like an ape. And another picture, you notice how different they are. This is Pithecanthropus alias, and this was done by Ernst Haeckel in Germany. And you can see that they are very, again, ape-like, but how different they are when people try to draw them. And this because, of course, they're drawn according to the artist's conception of what they look like. We had no direct evidence of what they look like, at least back at this time. And this is 2 statues which were found at the Chicago Field Museum. And this is memorable for me because I saw those when I was a young kid. And also when I did a presentation there, one of the persons in the audience said, yeah, I used to work there and I remember these, and now they're up in the attic of the Field Museum in Chicago, one of the most prestigious leading museums in the world. So it was pretty prominent having these displayed. And I would love if creationists could buy these and display them in our museums to show you what they were pictured as looking like about 50 years or so ago. Textbooks, we can see this is one of many, many examples. I have hundreds, but I'll just show you a couple. And this, you can see the 3 stages of human development. You can see the Java man at the far right, and then left from your viewpoint, and then Cro-Magnon man, and then, of course, Neanderthal man in the middle. And Cro-Magnon would be the most evolved, and in the middle is good old Neanderthal man. Another example, another picture. This is probably more realistic in a sense because it shows what they were ideally supposed to look like. Modern man, very modern. Neanderthal man, very much in between the gorilla and modern man. And so this is an artist's conception of where Neanderthals were. And I should mention, Neanderthals were one of the strongest proofs of evolution, human evolution, for over a century. And here you can see another picture. In the top is modern man, then Piltdown, of course, which has been shown to be a fraud, and the jaws shown here, and then orangutans. And then a picture in the other side, we can see a gorilla, Neanderthal man, and modern man. And then a picture, a drawing showing the various missing links. And you can see at the highest form, the highest in the picture was white, and then Mongol, and then Australian, and then you can see Neanderthal is below those 3 I just mentioned. And so therefore Neanderthal is again shown as a picture of a missing link. And this is again from a textbook. By the way, most of these have been shown to be not at all what they are, or they've been shown to be frauds like Piltdown, or problematic like Peking man, and the Java man, and Heidelberg man. And so it's interesting, the major links in evolution have now been shown to be pretty much false. Or, as you can see, the Mongol up here. Now, this surprises me to have a Mongol in this picture because usually they show, believe it or not, they show a gorilla, and then they show a Negro, and then they show a Caucasian guy. And for a century, the blacks were in the middle. They were seen as missing links. They were seen as proof of evolution. And I have many examples of that as well in my other PowerPoints. And so one thing that's clear, that evolution was for over a century, probably one of the racist ideas found in science or anywhere else. And I like to show these because you can see how indeed racist we were at one time, endeavoring to prove evolution. And here again, you can see the skulls. And Neanderthal is number 2. You have a side view and then a front view. And then, of course, modern man you see at the bottom of the picture. And there's another drawing. This is at the museum in Harvard, I believe Harvard University, or no, Yale University. You can see the picture of the brute, very ape-like, early Neanderthal. And he's got his family. They show his family there. But this is actually better than some because he looks fairly modern aside from the face. And here's another example. And you can see again how brutal he looks, very brutal, very brute-like. And then the next picture, I show a 1888 drawing by Professor Schaffhausen, a German scientist. And there we can see a picture of what he was supposed to look like. And how do they show this historically? Well, what they've done in many cases is they rearrange the data. And this is actually a common example. You can see the arrow, the blue arrow on the one picture. You can see where the jaw hinge should be. And you can see when it's moved over towards the front, so the jaw is protruded forward. You can see then from this picture, they can get a very ape-like appearance. And so this was commonly done. In fact, I've seen this on many other models and so on. They do not put the jaw where it belongs, in the hinge centerpiece. And other traits, thick brow, you can see, which actually I would think would be pretty useful today because they would be very protective. So many injuries hurt the eye, and this thick brow would help protect the eye against injuries. So from an evolutionary standpoint, we should have retained that indeed if that was the case. Stocky build, they made good football players. They're maybe 5'4", 5'5", quite strong, quite powerful. And you can see this picture shows that. Neanderthal population, when you look at the population, according to evolutionists, they say Neanderthals lived from 130,000 years to about 30,000 years ago. And this would mean there was a huge population of Neanderthals. In fact, they estimate you're talking about 2,500 generations. So there is a lot of generations, and therefore there should be a lot of fossils. They estimated 6 billion. Now, it might only be far less than that, but on the other hand, it's a lot of fossils. Now, we actually have a fair number of Neanderthal fossils because many were found in caves. They weren't buried. And therefore, because they lived and were stored the bodies in caves when they died, we have a fairly good large number of them. So we have a good idea of what indeed they look like. And but we don't have the fossils that you would expect if indeed they live for the hundreds of millions of years that they claim they used to live. One book by Jacques Cousteau, he talked about Neanderthals and why they had some of the features they had. And he concluded because as we age, the jaw and the facial features, as well as the whole skeleton system, changes shape. And the best example I can think of is I wear glasses, and where my glasses fit on my ear, we can see the skull is significantly indented. And it is indented at that position because of wearing glasses, and the skull therefore is reformed, it changed. It is somewhat malleable. And as a result, Jack and he's a dentist, by the way, and Jack basically in his research concluded that the features we see on Neanderthal are partially a result of simply living to be very old. And it had nothing to do with their innate abilities or tasks or traits. It had to do everything with the fact that they lived for, Jack claimed, for a long time. And therefore the traits changed. Long time, I'm not sure what he estimated, but probably 200, 150, 200, 300 years. And so it was a fairly long time. And he used the cephalometric examination. He examined the bones found in France, and as a result, he felt that this supported his conclusions about the facial traits of Neanderthals. And now we can see here is a skeleton of a Neanderthal and the skeleton of a modern man. First thing you'll notice is the height differences are fairly significant. Now, how were they able to assemble this skeleton? They have a complete skeleton. Well, they have enough bones from various sites that they were able to put them together. At one site, they didn't have a complete skeleton, but several sites they were able to put together a complete skeleton, and they produced the skeleton that you see there. And you can see the differences between the two different groups. You can see the barrel-chested of Neanderthals, the flatter, thinner chest of modern humans. You can see the legs were shorter, more robust, stronger, and so on. So you see a number of traits which indeed are shown in the skeleton, which show indeed that they were a different ethnic group. And then the next step is to take these bones and to put flesh on them. And this is done by people who take bones, and forensics usually, and they put flesh on them. And a good example, one of my favorite, is a woman disappeared in California and had no sign of her for, I think, about 6 years, 7 years. And they found some skeletons, some remains in a park 2 states away. And they took those remains And from them, they were able to do this technique, as you see here, put a flesh on them, and then they basically put what they found on TV, the picture of what they found, the flesh on the bones, primarily the skull, of course, and someone was able to identify the woman, who happened to be, I believe, from Cambodia originally, and they were able to locate where she lived, and they found out that she disappeared about 6-7 years ago. It was her neighbor, by the way, who said, "Oh, that was my neighbor. Yeah, she's my neighbor. I knew her very well. And this looks exactly like her." And so they're able to convict the husband of murder as a result of this building the flesh on this skeleton. And so it's a good example of how detailed and how accurate they now are in putting flesh on the bones. And here we can see the profile. Again, they're putting flesh on the bones. And there we've got more flesh. And then the last step is skin. And the next step, of course, is some coloration. And here we can see now the built-in part, the added part, plus the skeleton. And you can see how it was done. Now, from this skeleton, we have been able to produce quite an accurate picture of what Neanderthals look like. And we can see here this picture of a bald man. And then we can compare that to the picture drawn in 1888. And you can see a world of difference. The difference is science produced the one model, and an artist's conception and our belief in evolution produced the other model. And you can see enormous difference between the two. Very, very obvious. And when you put clothes on him, and we see here, this guy's got a nice hairdo. It's combed neatly, and he has a suit and a tie on. And this is a display in Germany. And basically they say he is all dressed up and no place to evolve. And this is what they said. I'm not saying this. This is what they said by the picture. And so I think to some degree, they were mocking the idea that their poor person who lived in Neander Valley has been pictured as an evolutionary link, and he is no such. Another picture, again, done the same way, except this was a young girl. And you can see that when flesh was put on her, you can see how she looks just like, well, the girl next door. Now, she could use a new suit of clothes. It's not very stylish what she's wearing. And she could certainly use a haircut, or at least her hair combed. But on the other hand, she looked very much like a modern young girl, about, I guess 8 or 9 years old is what she's supposed to be. And this is another reconstruction of a Neanderthal. In fact, that looks like a photograph of a person, as this does. And when I used to teach anthropology, I mentioned, is this a real girl? Is it a photograph, or is it a drawing? What is it? And they would say, well, it's a girl. It's just a girl, and she's wearing this funny clothes and this poor hairdo. And so they didn't see her as being any different than any girl that would walk around today. The same thing with this man. This is not a photograph of a man. This is where they took the skull bones and built a man, flesh and beard and so on him. And now we can see fully the glory of the difference. We can see the person put on the skeleton, and we can see what Neanderthal looked like and what a modern human looked like. And we can see that Neanderthals were very strong, made great football players. And I wouldn't want to meet a Neanderthal in a dark alley. Well, if I did, I'd be very polite to him because he doesn't look like someone you want to get into the wrong side of the day with him. And so, but very, very human. Now, why were they so bulky, so large? Well, because at this time in Europe, they had a cold spell, and therefore those with the thicker bodies were more apt to survive the very cold weather. And as a result, we had a tendency for this flesh to develop. This, by the way, is called Bergman's rule, not named after me, but another Bergman. And Bergman's rule says basically hot climates produce tall and thin body types, and cold climates produce short and stout and strong body types. And as we can see, this is a good example. The Watusis and other tribes in Africa who live in very hot climates, we can see their body is tall and thin, which conforms to Bergman's rule. Okay, some history behind Neanderthals. They're found in Dusseldorf, Germany, in Meander Valley. T-A-L-S means, or T-A-L means valley. So Neander Valley, what that means in German. And the first one was found in 1856, just a few years before the book that changed the world by Charles Darwin was published. And so as soon as his book was published, they jumped on Neanderthals as missing link and proof of evolution. And the early pictures, of course, he was constructed to look ape-like. And brain capacity now we know is about 200 cc's larger. Well, because their body type, their body was larger. So they had a larger brain because they had a stouter, stronger, more robust body. And the initial construction, of course, has now been shown to be not only wrong, but embarrassingly wrong. And other things we now know about them, since we've been doing much research, we found they use jewelry, which says something about them and about what they value. They use musical instruments. In fact, some of these we've discovered, you clean them up, and they can produce really high quality music. And so they were not just a crude instrument, but they were instruments that were well designed to indeed produce beautiful music. They did cave paintings, in fact, quite a few. They were capable of speech, so they could talk, and they buried their dead. And so as a result of these discoveries, we realized that they were just like the guy next door. They had the same behavior traits and propensities and tendencies and likes and dislikes that we have today. Okay, Neanderthal burial cities. Most anthropologists recognize burial as a very human and very religious act. And the strongest evidence that Neanderthals were fully human and of our species is the 4 sites where Neanderthals and modern humans were buried, what? Buried together. And so this discovery was pretty much the end of Neanderthals as our evolutionary ancestors, which, by the way, we're talking about over 100, 150 years. This was one of the best proofs there was of evolution. And, well, this discovery showed it to be wrong, absolutely wrong. And not 1, but 4. And the sites were investigated very carefully and found indeed that modern Neanderthals and, modern Neanderthals and modern humans were buried together, because now we know they were modern individuals just like all of us. And a good summary this far is that belief in evolution caused a distortion of the facts, but in the long run, science proved their stories were wrong. And I've often said this, evolution is going to be disproved, and pretty much has been disproved, by the way, by science. And so science, just let it keep on working, and it will indeed prove, has already done, our worldview. And this is why I and so many others find science so incredibly supportive, because it indeed shows empirically that my conclusions relative to creation and Genesis were right. And that is rewarding to be proven correct. Okay, a few Neanderthal traits. So there were many. Of course, the supraorbital torus is one example, the large brow ridge, large nasal capacity. And of course, in a cold climate, that would be helpful. And the flat, long brain case. So there were a number of physical traits. The occipital bun is another example. But then again, among the different racial groups today, which I prefer to call people groups, by the way, there are a number of similar traits. Wouldn't it be boring if we all look pretty much the same? We all have the same facial features, the same voice, the same appearance. The joy of life is we have so many varieties in not only people, but in dogs and in so many animals. And indeed, these variations should be celebrated and not condemned. And here you can see a quick modern man compared to Neanderthal comparisons. And we can see there were many, but they were all minor traits. They were nothing major. And now we can see Neanderthal versus modern man when we do the comparison. And in this case, they used a Polynesian to make the comparison, I guess because these were the two most extreme differences found among human skulls. And so therefore they took the greatest differences, and you can see them here. But of course, most of us are somewhere in between these two differences. The larger bell-like chest cavity of Neanderthals and wider pelvis that would produce a body which was strong, also very compact and dwarf-like in shape, and therefore an effective adaptation against the cold, which should be somewhat useful now for people today. So, conclusions about them: they had protruding brow ridges, a very stocky build, short extremities. They were an isolated population, although they were pretty much throughout Europe, as well as parts of Africa and parts of Asia. So they were, I guess, worldwide, they were somewhat isolated. They lived in a very cold and harsh climate, and they were also 100% human. And there we compare the two, and there you can see the differences are there, but not significant. And some modern examples, there are many. One of the most intriguing is a very famous evolutionist, William Hamilton, and he is said by his friends to have the general appearance of a Neanderthal. And he kind of looks like it, but unfortunately, he died fairly young, but he was a good example of people today that have Neanderthal traits. And here is a picture taken by a friend of mine, a dentist in South Africa, and he had a patient that had very pronounced Neanderthal traits. And I asked him, could you get pictures of your patient? He said, sure, next time he comes in, I'll ask. And he asked, and he got permission, and so here we go. A person with decided Neanderthal traits. And there we can see a profile. This was taken in his dental office. And this is a Russian parliamentarian. And you can see he had very pronounced Neanderthal traits. And he, by the way, I'm not sure how you judge him as being good looking or not so good looking, but the women must have judged him as good looking, because there's another picture of him. He had a gorgeous wife and 2 gorgeous kids. And so I guess somebody must have judged him as good looking. And therefore, even though he had some Neanderthal traits, it did not detract from his appearance nor his love offerings. Now, to go back in a few years ago, we can see a movie about Neanderthal man. And he was not only primitive, he was driven by mad desires. And you can see there he is molesting some attractive women who are not exactly enamored by him. And this was quite a successful movie, about 1953, I believe. But here we go, another picture of him. And there you can see the actor who played Neanderthal man in the movie. He looks like the stereotypical picture of a Neanderthal man. And now, even the evolutionists have labeled these people as our brethren. In fact, Michael Shermer, who is an active atheist, and he said these people in Scientific American, is where he said this, are our Neanderthal brethren. And the growing, this was back in, I say 1910, but that's the wrong date. But anyways, the growing consensus is, he said, they're just another race of humans. And there we go, the cover of New Scientist. And they concluded, we're one species, not two. They're simply another species of us. And so now this has gone mainstream. And as I said at the beginning, there is really no doubt about their status. And I guess to seal this conclusion in stone, the cover of National Geographic had a good article about, can you read that? The other humans. And indeed, they stated we are just other humans, as Neanderthals were all. But the most interesting was letters sent to the National Geographic. And one letter said, this is, the date's wrong, by the way. Interesting mistake here. February of, I think, 2009 is what it was. But the artist did a fine job this writer said, fleshing out a Neanderthal female, showing just what she looked like. She looked just like one of us. And this is indeed what is true. Another person wrote in, as a lifelong nudist, I've seen modern humans that are shaped exactly like that nude Neanderthal woman in your issue. Apparently, Neanderthals are not extinct after all. They congregate at nudist resorts. And there we can see a good example. And now we can go flashback to a few years ago. This is in a National Geographic and Life magazine article, which basically modern man is at the highest part, then Cro-Magnon, and then guess what? Below Cro-Magnon is the Neanderthal man. Another example of how they were used fairly recently to prove evolution. And now, Christianity Today had an article, The Search for the Historical Adam, and basically they point out, tragically, that many Christians accept human evolution in spite of the fact that science has shown it did not occur. And yet, some pastors are behind the times and still accept the idea of human evolution based on Neanderthal-looking individuals. And here's a couple more pictures from this 1965 book, and I use this because that's not that long ago. And we're beginning to realize that Neanderthals are our brethren, and yet the textbooks took a while to catch up. And you can see then evolution of man and his tools. In the larger picture, we can see the same pictures, Neanderthals right towards the middle. And this is the worst, I think. This is a 1961 Life magazine, Life, I think it's from a Life book. But you can see anyways, the monkeys and our monkey ancestor, and walking out of the picture is a Neanderthal. And so this was still featured in publications not that long ago. And there's a better picture you can see of our Neanderthal brethren. And you can see right by him the apes. And of course, the picture, as they say, tells 1,000 words. And that's the end of the presentation. So any questions or comments?
Dr. Bergman, again, thank you so much for another great presentation. Last time apes as ancestors, this time Neanderthals. And again, more great feedback from the chat. I've watched many lectures on Neanderthals, many as recent, Dr. Bergman, as 2021, where these paleoanthropologists say things like Neanderthals are us, just built for an eco-glacial environment. They're not a separate species, they'll say, but the same species. And these are scientists on the evolutionist side admitting this now pretty well, what biblical creationists have been admitting for years and years and predicting. My question to you, and a few variants of this came in from the chat. So what I can do is put it up on screen, because although many paleoanthropologists are saying that Homo neanderthalensis is the same species as us, there are some, even in the creation world, that have claimed humans can speciate and would actually place Neanderthal as a separate species. Is there any validity to the multiple species of human model, Jared?
No, because we now know that they did interbreed, as indicated by the burial of modern man and Neanderthal man. They interbred. And now they've done with 23andMe and other these companies that analyze our genetics, they found indeed that there are certain genes that are unique to Neanderthals. And guess what? I have some of those genes. And when I mention this to other people, I've had several people say, yeah, I've got some of those genes too. And so, in fact, among my genetic past, I have German, of course, and Finnish, and a few other Jewish genes. But by and large, I've got a couple Neanderthal genes, which now they use to type where someone came from and their national background. In fact, by the way, people sign up for 23andMe and these other companies mostly to find out about their genetic past ethnically. They want to find out, are my relatives from Europe, or where are they from? And therefore, we've found that in my background, which of course makes sense because my relatives are from the part of Europe that Neanderthals lived. And so it doesn't surprise me that they found indeed a few genes in my body, which are Neanderthal genes. Not a lot, but I think there was 4 or 5% they found, were Neanderthal genes. And so therefore, obviously they interbred. When they do genetic analysis of people who spent their whole life in Australia or South America or other places, they don't find any of these Neanderthal genes. They find these Neanderthal genes in people who are primarily from Eastern Europe, which is where my relatives are from. And therefore, it makes sense that they would mix in with me and not mix in with Australians and other groups, because Neanderthals did not live to a significant number in other parts of the world, and therefore they are going to be found in people who were from Eastern Europe, as they were in my case. So there's no question that we can, by definition, if you can interbreed, you are seen as a single species. And that's this common definition. It's not perfect, but on the other hand, saying that they were different species moves, to me, too far into racism, which I have a problem with.
Amen. Well said. I completely agree. According to the biological definition of species, if you can interbreed, you're the same species, and we literally have their genes. So, by definition, we'd be the same species as them. And so the counter response I've seen, even from those in the creation world that would hold to Neanderthals being a separate species, Dr. Bergman, is they'll say, well, the genetics are dissimilar enough. They'll say Neanderthals are 99.7% the same as us, rather than how we are all 99.99% similar. So they'll say that very minute difference in genetics makes them a separate species. What would be a good response to that argument?
Well, I think as 23andMe and these other companies are doing, when you look at people throughout the world, like the Australian Aborigines, my guess is you probably would find that there's maybe 0.3 difference between us and them as well. So if you think about a 0.3 difference is very, very small, considering the differences that you see among people. I mean, be 99.3% similar is very, very similar genetically. And therefore, it doesn't surprise me that, in fact, I would expect certain groups to have a greater difference. But as far as I know, they haven't done a lot of genetic testing among Australian Aborigines, so therefore, and among other groups, Polynesians, for example. And so therefore, we don't have enough data. But my guess is in time, we will have enough data to make these comparisons.
That's a good response. And I find it very interesting and curious, Dr. Bergman, that a lot of technical papers have come out suggesting that Neanderthals were highly inbred. They suffered a high genetic load because they were oftentimes isolated. And when you're isolated for long periods of time and you're inbreeding, a lot of these deleterious mutations come to the forefront and lead to rapid genetic degeneration. And there's one technical article I like to cite that talks about how Neanderthals were 40% less fit than modern humans. And therefore, wouldn't that be a factor to consider in why they may be slightly different in terms of genetics from modern humans?
Oh yeah, clearly it would be that wouldn't be surprising. In a cold climate, they couldn't do much traveling, and so they interbred a lot, as we see the Amish have done, and therefore that's caused a problem. So yeah, I wouldn't doubt that there were a lot of accumulation of mutations back then, at least compared to the people around them who were able to travel around and who had means of traveling in water. Of course, this is one efficient way of traveling, and therefore you could travel to other places and interbreed. By the way, now they estimate that in this country alone, about 1 out of every 6 marriages are interracial, between white and black or white and Chinese and so on. And so therefore we have a lot of interbreed in this country because you can do so. There's so many people from other countries that live here, and therefore interbreeding is more common because of accessibility. We tend to marry people that we live nearby, or we go to school with, or we go to work with, and we have some relationship, we can get to know people. And so therefore, as more and more of our racial barriers break down, we have more and more blacks working with whites and so on. And of course, as you expect, they're going to meet, fall in love, and marry. And that's what we see happening.
Amen. Well said. So would you say, Jerry, then, that a lot of their morphology could be explained by adaptation, environmental adaptation to the eco-glacial environments that they existed in, while their genetics, at least the end stage Neanderthal that we look at, could be explained due to inbreeding, isolation, founder effects, and, as you were pointing out, accelerated mutation accumulation.
Yeah, that would explain quite a bit of it, I would say.
Okay. That's a great response. And one another curious thing, and then I'll get on to the next question, is you pointed out the environments that they lived in, right? It would be harsh, cold, dark. You know, they'd certainly be lacking certain vitamins. Therefore, all it would take is a mutation in an important DNA repair enzyme to result in more and more mutations now accumulating generation after generation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's...
So we got a lot of interesting questions here. So I do want to thank the audience for being so engaged in these important topics, as they are some of my favorite topics as well. So Redefined Living says there are some that claim Noah could have been Erectus or the Erectus type or variation. What are your thoughts on this? Have you heard of this, Jerry?
Well, I don't know how you conclude that. I know, as far as I know, he was a Semitic type, so he had traits of Semites. And so, although he was fairly close to the original creation, mutation-wise, so therefore he was very healthy. So, of course, again, Homo erectus is a label, and even creationists disagree whether or not its skeleton, they say, is Homo erectus, was Homo erectus or modern man, and so on. So we get into a lot of distinctions which really can't be made with a lot of certainty. And that bothers me when we start to look at this minutia, which is not very, very difficult to make different claims. We have so many people today that are really quite different, but yet they're, we know, part of our group and part of our race and part of our, you know, you can intermarry with them and so on. So I think we've focused too much on external traits. When I taught at the medical school, people are always surprised that when you did heart transplants and organ transplants and so on, it didn't matter the race of the person. And they think, oh, you mean you can take an organ from a black and put it into a white? That's not what they're concerned about. They're concerned about immunological compatibility. And that does not relate much to race. And so therefore they did not really bother looking at race. In fact, if you ask what race this organ came from, this kidney came from, they don't know. They don't care. They're just concerned about whether or not it's histologically compatible. And so therefore it wasn't an issue. So we tend to judge too heavily on external traits and not physical traits that are more relevant.
Amen. I completely agree. And I like to say, in determining ancestry, answering the question of ancestry, it's in our genetics, it's in our DNA that would be the best way to answer that question. And that's why when we look to the genetics of Neanderthal, we see that we've interbred with them. So at that point, that should be enough to conclude that we're the same species. I would say if we had the DNA of Erectus, it would probably tell us some of the same things. And from my study into Erectus, they seem to have been subject, and as you pointed out, it's more so just a label. So a lot of the specimens that we've seen seem to be the result of reductive evolution. And that's why we see a lot of their features, like the smaller brain and just a lot of the anomalies that have been manifested in them. I know that's a conclusion made in the book Contested Bones as well. So for me, it would be then hard to say that Noah would have been Erectus, because you pointed out, Dr. Bergman, correct me if I'm wrong, Noah would have been closer to the flood and therefore healthier and probably not subject to reductive evolution. Right.
That's true. And a major problem we have in looking at all these fossils is that what we have is lots of fragments. And I think Mark Twain said it best. The fossil record is a few small pieces of bone and a few buckets of plaster Paris. And that's what Mark Twain said. And he wasn't exactly, a Christian, active Christian. So he said, I think quite accurately indeed, that we're taking some bone parts and trying to put them together, and indeed that has a lot to do with your perception of what the end result should look like, and therefore we have to be very careful.
Well said. That's such a great point that I want the audience to consider and kind of absorb, because bones found in the dirt, for one, you're pointing out the fossil record is highly fragmented and low quality. And bones can be deceiving, because even today, Dr. Bergman, we know there oftentimes exists more morphological variation within the same species than across species. But we know various species, like if we look at the different canid species, we know they interbreed.
Right.
But a fossil, how are we supposed to be able to tell what may be the result of, let's say, homology or convergent evolution in a fossil? We don't have their genetics. We can't do breeding tests.
And the dog is a good example. If you compare the fossils of dogs, and I've seen pictures that do this, you would say these are clearly different species. They cannot be the same species. Well, we know they are because we know that they're dogs, like a pug, for example, and a German Shepherd, and a dog that has a bulldog, for example. We see very, very different bone shapes. And as a result, we would conclude, if we just had the fossil, we would conclude that these were just different animals. But we don't. You know, in this case, we have the dog and we can obtain the fossils, and we know, therefore, that they were the same species.
Amen. Well said. Well said, Dr. Bergman. So here's another question that comes in. We got a ton of questions here. So this one comes in from Cool Jesus. And he asks, can you ask Jerry if he agrees with some of the conclusions, I guess, made by some baraminologists that assign Homo naledi specifically? Not sure if you have an opinion on this, Jerry, that place Naledi as a human in the human baramin.
I know there's a lot of controversial in his study he did a baraminology comparison, and there's a lot of controversy. And I have problems with, I guess, putting him with the humankind, but on the other hand, I try to look at the whole broad picture and try to look at the trends that we see, and not, you know, one individual. Again, I'm somewhat skeptical, since I've spent a lot of time with my book as Apes as Ancestors. Spent a lot of time looking at the fossil record, and I find, again, we've got so many fragments. They're often distorted because of pressure. They're often as a result of heating and cooling changes and so on. And therefore, it's hard to get the right parts and assemble them properly to determine indeed what this is like. So, and I guess I have to admit, I'm somewhat skeptical of baraminology, because what we do is take certain traits and make comparisons on those traits. But if I took a different set of traits, I may come up with a different conclusion. And so therefore, I've always been kind of, I mean, it's helpful and useful on the other hand, but I've noticed a lot of baraminology research doesn't, to me, further our understanding of the animal differences very much at all. So it's it depends on what traits you select.
I agree with that 100%. That's a fantastic answer. It's similar to what the evolutionists do in their family trees and in phylogenetic systematics, where there's something I'm sure you're familiar with, Jerry, incomplete lineage sorting. While depending on what gene you're looking at, you can look at one gene and build a family tree across a variety of different species, and you'll get one hierarchy. But then if you look at a different gene, you get an entirely different family tree. So it's very selective, I've noticed.
Yeah, it is.
So here's a question that's kind of a question that has to do with the bigger picture of what we're looking at in terms of fossils. And I know you've touched on this here in this book that I highly recommend, Fossil Forensics. Big book, tons of great information. So I want to encourage people to check that out. And the question is, Dr. Bergman, how do we best explain the ordering of the fossil record? Evolutionists will look to the ordering as a progression from simpler organisms to more complex organisms, right? Marine creatures at the bottom, up to reptiles, mammals, and then eventually man in the series of, I guess, macroevolution. From a creationist starting point, how would we best explain that?
Well, I know you won't find the proper fossil ordering in any one place on the Earth. In order to get that, you have to look at many different fossil positions, and then you put it together. Number one. Number two, my main problem is that I've spent not a lot of time fossil hunting, but it's amazing how many, when you dig for fossils, you don't find much evidence of that ordering in most places. You find, first of all, about 80% of all the organisms you find are marine type. And you find just even the more advanced, so-called more advanced organisms, you don't find those necessarily really, really deep. A lot of these they find them fairly close to the surface. Like organisms, human fossils, they find that most of them that I'm familiar with when I talk about where they found them at, most of them stick up out of the ground, and they, of course, notice, gee, that's looks like a fossil, and they dig a few inches underneath, and they find it is a fossil, and so then they start looking in this area to find evidence of the rest of the fossil. And so I'm not aware of any case where they've dug 40, 50 feet down and found human fossils or pre-human fossils. I'm aware only of where they found basically fossils near the surface. Now, of course, they claim they were 30 feet down, and then erosion produced the situation to where they're near the surface. On the other hand, I'm skeptical of where fossils are found if you can determine much at all about where they are in the fossil record by simply where they're found. I know that's commonly done, but I know a problem is they determine the age of the rocks by the fossils. They determine the fossil age by the rocks they're found in. So I know they criticize that as a claim that's false. But on the other hand, in many cases, when I've looked at the details, this is all too often what you find. And so I'm not really impressed with this fossil ordering, the fossil staircase. But they're found in every geology book, so they're very commonly found, but I think it's a distortion of reality when you line them all up nice and neat, so you get the primitive organism at the bottom and the most advanced at the top. And all too often, most of the time, you don't find that neat ordering.
Well said. That's such an important point, because the way that they represent it is actually inconsistent with the way that it's actually found in the so-called geologic column. And even when you were to, if you were to just shift away from bones found in the dirt a little bit to genetics, and we've discussed, Jerry, in the previous program and a bit here today, that deleterious mutation accumulation is a real thing. So when you look to the fossil record and you see these living fossils like the coelacanth, the horseshoe crab, that are in supposedly hundreds of millions of years worth of strata. Well, based on what we know today, that mutation accumulation puts shelf lives on genomes. How could these living fossils have survived for hundreds of millions of years?
Yeah, that's true.
Here's a good question. And of course, being a discussion here, the answer would be limited. So again, I do want to recommend your book, Fossil Forensics. But the question is, Jerry, in your book, Fossil Forensics, you discuss whale evolution. What are your thoughts on the claims of a whale vestigial pelvis? And I will say, Jerry, I host a lot of creation evolution debates here, and the evolutionists in 2022 are still using this in almost every debate. And they'll say that, you know, this so-called leftover pelvis is evidence of walking whales in the past. What's a good way to rebut that?
Yeah, from my reading, it's pretty clear that it's pretty hard to copulate in the water when you weigh 2,000, 5,000 pounds. And so therefore, from my reading, I thought it was pretty well agreed that these facilitated copulation of whales in the water. And so they, from what I, same with snakes, they facilitate copulation. And so therefore, it's a stretch to me to claim that these were the remnants or the beginning of legs developing. Usually they claim the remnants, of course, of legs. And legs are pretty handy to get around. And I'll tell you, to lose legs, they really had a hard time explaining why an organism would lose legs, since they are really very important in getting around. And so the idea that we were four-legged mammals and then ended up evolving into whales, I think is probably one of the most, I hate to say ludicrous, but it's probably one of the most foolish ideas they've ever come up with. I went to a conference once, and the question was asked, what is the best evidence for evolution? And the paleontologist there brought up the evolution of whales. And I thought, oh no, this is just really problematic. There must be a much better example than that. And that's what he talked about. And as he talked about the fossil evolution from primitive four-legged walking mammal to whales, I thought, boy, this is just nitpicking, just selecting examples out of nowhere that didn't seem to belong together. And they try to put them in a path from mammals to four-legged quadrupeds to whales. Really is a stretch. And I wasn't too impressed with that as being very useful proof. But anyways, it's from what, and as far as I know, this is not disputed that these are facilitate copulation of the whales. And that's true with snakes. It's true with whales as well. So I'm not aware of any study that contradicts that. So I guess if the person had a reference they could give me, then I could look it up and see what they had to say.
As with a lot of their claims in terms of these evolutionary leftovers, these vestigial organs, we find that they're not actually the ancient remnants of past evolutionary structures that have either devolved, altered their function, the various claims that they'll make. These structures actually are functional components to the respective organisms, as you're pointing out. They are. These so-called vestigial legs are necessary. They connect to some very important muscles that assist in reproduction and copulation, as you're pointing out. So then what is your thoughts overall, Jerry, on the series that they like to present in textbooks, where you've got, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Basilosaurus, eventually up to modern whales? What are your thoughts on that series that they like to represent?
And I've done a whole book on this. It's not published yet, but it's pretty clear to me. You're just talking about different animals. You do a lot of digging, a lot of research. You find animals, you line them up, and you get progression from a tetrapod to whales. And there are so many differences which indicate that you're not looking at progression. You're simply looking at different animal, different traits, different lifestyle. And so I think it's really stressed to try to line these up and make any inferences from these. All of them in the trail, to me, look like they survived quite well as they were. And so I'm not sure how you can say, well, these were less effective and therefore they evolved other traits and therefore they eventually became whales as a result of improving their survivability. So I just don't see that at all. And maybe I should go in more detail that in my book, but you end up with 400-page book and people don't. They say every time you add another chapter to a book, you reduce the sales by 10%. So that's true. I've got a couple of books on racism and evolution, and I have to admit, I haven't even opened the book up because they're like 900 pages. And I thought, I don't know if I can read. I mean, it's a doorstop book. And I don't know if I can read 900 pages. I mean, we know evolution was racist, but 900 pages, I don't think I can read that. And then the same author, by the way, realized that it wasn't selling many books. So he's got the abbreviated version, which is only 150 pages. And I bought the 150-page book, and I may be inclined to read that because I'll read a 150-page book, but I'm not going to read a 900. I mean, it's like a phone book, a thick phone book.
Right.
I don't know how you could say that much about racism and evolution, but I guess the guy did. And so that's a problem.
Yeah, I just wish there was more time in the day to get through all of the many books that and I'm sure you want to get through. And in writing books, as you've pointed out, sometimes it's difficult to know when to end because there really is endless information out there. So here's another question again, a question that you've responded to thoroughly and comprehensively in your many books, specifically here, Fossil Forensics, that I have next to me. How do we debunk or address the argument that says or insists modern birds evolved from theropod-like dinosaurs? And as a matter of fact, taxonomists would actually say modern birds are living dinosaurs.
I know that's a claim that's often made, and I haven't looked thoroughly into that issue, but I have looked at a few things. Like, for example, a bird heart is very much like a mammal heart. In fact, if I remember right, it's a 4-chambered heart like our heart is, whereas a reptile heart is very different. I think it's a 3-chambered heart, but the heart is designed very differently, and therefore that's one of many different organ structures, which gives a contrast between reptiles and birds and makes them closer to mammals. Another one, of course, is the lung system, which is very different from that of dinosaurs. The problem is when you're trying to figure out where birds evolved from, what choices do you have? And they select the best choice available, which is to me a very poor choice. They're not going to say, well, I guess we have no idea where they evolved from. We have no even clues. But to me, it's pathetic when they have to choose birds evolved from dinosaurs, especially when you consider the biological differences are enormous. Again, birds are far more like us mammals than they are like dinosaurs. And therefore, yeah, you get some morphological similarities, of course, the bird feet, and you have dinosaurs that have very bird-like feet. So there are some similarities. But aside from those, the anatomy and the physiology is just world apart difference. And so I think they're better off saying we have no idea where birds evolved from. But I guess when someone asks you a question, you try to answer it, and they say, well, where did birds evolve from? Well, I got dinosaurs. You have an answer, but to me, they're really stretching it to come up with a birds evolved from dinosaurs. There's just morphologically and anatomically, there's just huge differences. In fact, in many ways, birds are unique, not only from reptiles, dinosaurs, but also from mammals as well. So indeed, they're designed in many ways very, very differently. And so,
thank you, Jerry, for the response. So I'm assuming you wouldn't hold to the position that says theropod dinosaurs had feathers, feathered dinosaurs.
I'm not very impressed so far with the findings so far. And there are a number of evolutionary paleontologists who are not impressed either. And they think what looked like feathers were not feathers, but they were certain indentations as a result of certain structures in the dermis of the reptile. And so it's, I'm not very impressed. And I think if that was the case, you would have much more evidence. Also, what would be the function of feathers on dinosaurs? I know they say, well, they're thermal, help them stay warm. That's true. There's some arguments you can make for feathers, but on the other hand, a feather is a very unique, very differently designed structure. It's very, very different from scales, of course, very, very different from skin. And so therefore, to explain where feathers evolved from is a problem, and you're not getting very far in arguing dinosaurs had feathers. But of course, you know, you have a lot of strange life around, and it's certainly possible that some dinosaurs could have had feathers, but that doesn't prove they're evolving into birds.
Right.
It proves they have, you know, they're strange creatures that have feathers like an ostrich. I mean, that don't seem to belong, but they're very useful in that bird. But on the other hand, it's to some degree, it wouldn't bother me if they were fur instead of feathers. It would just, to me, look like the same animal. And I can't see the advantage of having feathers, but I guess for appearance sake and for variety. It's said that one thing you learn about God by studying nature is God loves variety. And these are one of many, many examples which show that.
That's a good response, Dr. Bergman, especially considering today what we see in terms of biodiversity is just a snapshot into the overall biodiversity that's existed on the planet. So we have some interesting creatures today, like the platypus, and we've had some interesting creatures in the past. And like you were kind of pointing out, is there are some even in the evolutionist camp. This is a more recent book, I believe from 2020, that I bought from Alan Fiducia. He's no supporter of young Earth creation, and even he would challenge this idea of feathered dinosaurs. So here's the next question that comes in here. This comes in from Gangster Ghost, and he asks, I have a question about evolution. Is it true what they say that we have genes from other animals? That's what Aaron Ross says. I think if I were to interpret this question, maybe he's looking to just like the similar genetic sequences that we find in the biological world, homologous sequences that evolutionists would say we've inherited from common ancestors. So do similar genes represent evolutionary history, Jerry?
There's a lot of similar genes. Talking about the heart, so many organisms have a four-chambered heart, and I would assume that they would have many genes that produce a four-chambered heart. They have the valves that are necessary. They have the center, the system which allows them heart to beat properly, the pacemaker, and all the other structures. So yeah, there's a lot of genes. In fact, they found a lot of genes even in worms that are similar to those found in humans. So it doesn't surprise me, because all life has to have certain things to live. It all has to have some system to pump blood around the body. And all animals with a certain size, of course, require some type of heart pumping system. And so therefore, you're going to have a lot of genetic similarity. And chemically, there's so many, of course, similarities between all animals that you're going to find so many of the genes. Biochemically, there's so many similarities. The genetics is so similar. So I would expect there's a lot of similarities between the genes of all animals that have genes. And that doesn't surprise me that you find similarities. I would expect to find more. And even among bacteria, you've got so many genes that are common to bacteria are common to us as well, because they have the similar genetic system. They have to be able to convert RNA into protein, and so therefore they have very similar systems that do that. So, and that's why you can take a gene from a human and splice it into a bacteria, and it does the work of producing this stuff that humans can produce. So there are so many similarities all life must have in order to live. And so that doesn't surprise me at all. Not the least.
That's a great response. Great point there, Jerry. I appreciate that response to obviously a common evolutionary argument that I know you're familiar with. And one thing I want to add too is I find it interesting that even in the similar genetic sequences that we find, let's say, between humans and chimpanzees, we find vast differences in terms of the way these genes are expressed, or even in terms of, epigenetics. So even in the similar sequences, there's still differences, which I think is a challenge for evolutionary theory. So it's always such a good time talking to you, Jerry. You are an encyclopedia worth of information. I just noticed we're over the hour mark, so time's flying by with you. I'm going to start winding it down here. I want to respect your time. And I'm going to get the last couple questions here that at least do have to do with Neanderthals specifically, as that's the main topic. And then we'll kind of wrap it up here, Jerry. So this one comes in from Cool Jesus, and he apologizes if he may have missed it. But he wanted to ask you, just to clarify, can you ask Jerry when he believes Neanderthals existed after the flood?
Oh, I think they probably did. I think they existed after the flood, yeah. And I think that the body's somewhat malleable. It's limited, of course, but it's amazing how well we can adapt to various climates and various differences in the environment. And I think the Neanderthals simply adapted to the environment, and as a result, they have certain body traits which were common in that part of the world. And therefore, I think that and from what we found in the fossil record and in caves and so on, it's pretty clear that they existed after the flood, and therefore it would assume, if they did not exist after the flood, that the caves and so on, which were often their home, would have been destroyed during the flood, and therefore my guess is it's likely that they lived after the flood. In fact, some people think the Neanderthals lived as a separate group until 1,500, 2,000 years ago. And so therefore they probably existed for quite a while. And I think by and large they interbred, and they were bred out of existence. And that's called genocide by intermarriage. And that's what's concerns about the Jews in Israel. They're concerned about intermarriage is going to cause genocide of the Jews. And therefore, they're trying to encourage, at least in Israel, marriage among other Jews so that the Jews don't become extinct as a result of intermarriage, which, of course, is happening now. You find, as I mentioned, 1 out of 6 marriages are interracial in this country. And if that keeps up, guess what's going to happen? You're not going to have many white guys walking around, many black guys walking around. There'll be eventually, assuming this intermarriage continues, eventually a high percent of the population will have brown eyes, brown hair, brown skin, and that's a result of intermarriage. And so we can literally have genocide through intermarriage. And that's, by the way, why some in the past discouraged intermarriage, because they realized that that would be genocide, and God created the different races for a reason, and genocide by intermarriage they felt would be wrong. Of course, with society's changes, that's no longer accepted, but by and large, that's true, though. And you see, when I look at my students and so on, I find so many are obviously a product of interracial marriage, and they're typically brown skin, brown eyes, and brown hair. They lose all these unique traits, and that's, of course, the result of intermarriage. And although that's going to take a while before a group becomes extinct, but if you notice on TV especially, you'll notice so many of the blacks really look more like Mexicans or Hispanic or some other group because of intermarriage, which is fine. I mean, that's, in fact, the early fathers in America, Jefferson and so on, realized that that is how we eliminate racism, is intermarriage. And they, in Washington and Jefferson's day, they actually encouraged intermarriage and tried to develop systems which would encourage intermarriage. Like if you had married a person of a different race, you got $500 or something. And that's limited. And of course, time went beyond that, and that wasn't implemented to a high degree. But on the other hand, there were quite a few mixed race people that owned slaves. And so they were technically blacks and they owned slaves. There's a whole book about this, which I haven't read yet, but it's on my list of books to read. And they found most of these were blacks who had slaves were as a result of an intermarriage between a white and a black. And also the whites and the Indians intermarried quite a bit, as well as the Indians and the African Americans intermarried quite a bit. And so you had a mixture of different groups. So I would say probably the Neanderthals just intermarried, and that's why so many of us have Neanderthal traits, because of intermarriage.
Appreciate it, Jerry. And I guess one question I would have when it comes to the Neanderthal DNA and how we know that we actually interbred with them, we have their genetics and there's specific genetic markers we can look to. Why do you think it is that we can get DNA from Neanderthal specimens, but not other, so-called hominids like Erectus or Hobbit or Nilot, at least not yet? Why do you think that is, Jerry?
Well, one problem is I think the Neanderthals were around for a lot longer period than some of these others were. And we have so many. And I've always been somewhat skeptical, but it seems like they've done a good job sequencing Neanderthal genes, especially mitochondria. But still, I have some question whether or not you have a skeleton which is 2,000 years old, whether or not the DNA has been preserved that well. I know in teaching forensics, I taught forensics for a number of years, and we have people we know died in 1947. And yet in court, they can argue that you cannot base any comparisons on someone that died in 1947 because the DNA through cosmic radiation and so on is going to be deteriorated to the point where you can't make comparisons. And so if you have a hard time making comparisons for a person that died 50, 100 years ago, how can you make comparisons of Neanderthals who they claim died off 50,000 years ago? So, of course, my guess is they didn't die off that long ago. But on the other hand, I've always had a hard time accepting the findings because of concerns about contamination and so on. I know they claim they really try to look at this. They use Clean Labs Level 5 in order to do the research, to make sure there wasn't contamination. And they worked really, really hard to try to get the accurate DNA codons. And they seem to have succeeded, but in my mind, there's some question whether or not they were able to succeed as well as they think they have. So that's my answer.
Well, I appreciate the answer. Okay, we're going to wind it down with this last question. I will say there's been a lot of questions that come in. You're a fan favorite here, Dr. Bergman, and to the audience, thank you for being so engaged with this topic and asking so many good questions. So here's the final question. Before we wrap it up, I do want to encourage those in the audience, share this around. It's an important topic. So the question, Dr. Bergman, is evolutionists look to African genetic diversity to argue that humans are older than 4,000 to 6,000 years. They'll say this is why, humans came out of Africa rather than Babel. Is at least one of their arguments is genetic diversity. And generally the diversity in Africa is higher than non-Africans. Do you have any thoughts on this? And what would be a good response to proponents of out of Africa?
It's intriguing in that the problem has not been what they claim it is here. The problem has been the opposite. Why are humans so similar? Why are we 99.9% similar? And so to get that similarity, if we're indeed, if we evolved out of Africa 6,000 to 10,000 or whatever, I guess much longer, 50 to 100,000 years ago, the dates depends upon who you ask. But on the other hand, so therefore they postulate a bottleneck is what caused the similarity. So we had lots of different apes interbreeding and so on, and we had a bottleneck where there was only a few dozen left or a few hundred maybe left. There's a small number left. And so therefore we descended from that small number. And so they have in fact, the opposite problem. Why are we so similar? And the bottleneck is an explanation. So when they try to go back to these 50, 100,000 years or so ago, that's a problem for the similarity. It's not a problem for us, it's a problem for them. And evolutionists have solved that, of course, by the bottleneck explanation. But I know people argue that, and they say, well, at least there must have been 50 to 60 different primates that survived that bottleneck, and we evolved from them. But on the other hand, that's problematic in many ways, because still, again, 99.9% similar is just so few differences between humans. Too small to have evolved from creatures that live many, many thousands of years ago. And so that's a problem they have. And of course, that's the idea behind the historic Adam and the historic Eve, that there are too many similarities. So therefore, they trace us back to a small number of people. So they've supported our position, not their position.
You know, Dr. Bergman, that answer is so great that, to me, that's a really fatal blow to, well, out of Africa and deep time evolution, because if we've been evolving Australopithecines to habilis to erectus to, modern humans for millions of years, accumulating mutations, and mutations are adding genetic diversity, why do we have such low diversity? And you pointed out that they invented a post hoc rescue device, an out of Africa population bottleneck. But correct me if I'm wrong, in order to reduce those levels of genetic diversity to roughly what we have today, wouldn't they need a multi-generational bottleneck? Like, wouldn't it have to be thousands of years of just inbreeding and degeneration due to the inbreeding?
Yeah, or several bottlenecks. That's another theory. So that we had 2 or 3 historic bottlenecks and got the population down to a couple 100,000, and later on it got it down to several hundred, and later on it got it down to 50 or 60 families. So that's why we have so many similarity. But there's a lot of speculation, and I guess I have a hard time with speculating. We need to, the area I look at, there's not much speculation going on, just the facts. It's primarily what I'm doing now is comparing the theories of the evolution of organs, the evolution of the heart, of the liver, of the lungs, of bone, of the brain, of eyes, and so on. And I'm finding in doing that, none of these systems can they really explain the evolution of the organ. The first lung was a lung, functioned as a lung. We have no viable explanation as where the lung could evolve from. The first heart was a heart. The first liver was a liver. The first kidney was a kidney. The first bladder was a bladder. The first, you name it, the first tongue was the tongue. So I just did an article recently on the tongue evolution, and therefore over and over, you see that they just can't explain where these came from, and the literature is very clear. You can't even imagine what a pre-kidney would look like. I mean, you can get some theories of what it would look like, but on the other hand, a kidney has a very specific function, and it's very hard to get a system that works as well as a kidney that would substitute for a kidney that is not a kidney. I mean, you certainly have filtration system, but these aren't animals that don't have hearts. They have basically circulation within the entire cell, and therefore it doesn't really support their worldview. Eventually, I'll do every organ, and eventually I'll hopefully produce another book which covers the evolution of all organs, showing there's no evidence for any of them. That's what
those are the.
Go ahead.
Yeah, those are the facts. That is that which is empirical. I love the work that you're doing, and I guess I'll sneak this in here because Dr. Bergman, you recently published a technical paper in the Answers Research Journal titled "The Problem of Over-Design in Darwinism." That's a very interesting topic and title. Can you kind of touch on this a little bit, maybe just for the audience, and provide a little bit of details for people to check that out?
Yeah, evolution basically says that we have evolved what we have evolved because it helps in our survival. And survivability is important in what we evolve. It's selected because we've evolved organs that help us, give us slight edge compared to others that don't have that. Well, there's so many traits that people have that are just mind-boggling, and we can't imagine a survival reason for them. And many examples, like think I talk about the memorizers, people who can literally memorize. There's a number of 5, 6, 10 in the world that they know of that can remember every day of their life. And so you say, okay, June 3rd, 1978, what were you doing? Oh, that would be a Thursday. And what was I doing? Well, I just had a party at that time. And oh, yes, I had a, and they can describe in detail what happened on that day. And so we're talking about people who have a memory of virtually almost every day of their life and can recount in details what happened. The calendar calculators is another simpler and more common. If you say December 12th, what day would that be? Or December 12th, 1902. Well, that would be a Tuesday. And then they can tell you some details about the day, these calendar calculators. And another more interesting example is the acrobatic people who can just do tricks, can flip 3 times over and land on their feet and do it accurately. And you wonder, why in the world would that be helpful for us in survival? And the concern is that none of us can do that, hardly. A few people can do that. And so therefore, how can those few people achieve these incredible feats where the vast majority can't? And you can't imagine a beneficial use of that ability. I mean, when you're jumping off trees and so on, I guess to land on your feet would be useful. So on the other hand, to develop these skills would just not seem to be survival helpful. And another example is piloting a plane. Here, these people can travel at 300, 400, 500, 600 miles per hour and accurately get a plane up in the air and fly a plane and get it down. And yet, how would we evolve that skill to be able to do that? And yet, people can be trained to do that. And people can be trained to do all kinds of incredibly feats. And why would they have these abilities when indeed there's just, it's not survival factor. Music is another one. How does music help us survive? Why do some people develop incredible talents playing musical instruments and music? Now, evolutionists try to explain that away. They basically say that, well, we've evolved the ability to sing because that attracts mates, and therefore we're more apt to reproduce, and therefore we're more apt to pass on those genes to our offspring. Well, that sounds plausible, but on the other hand, 99% of us don't have exceptional musical talents, and we reproduce without a problem. And so therefore, my guess is not many women, that's not a major factor in selecting a mate. That may help, especially if they have an interest in music, but that's not going to be something most women focus on. And so the social reinforcement claim, I think, is vacuous. And therefore, we have those talents. And some people have incredible talent, ability to play 9 instruments. And you put them on a piano and they can just play. And I think I mentioned in my article a couple of examples of 4, 5, 6-year-olds who play Beethoven and can not only play it, but they can create new music and create on the piano. And so what advantage would that have to survivability? They're 5 years old and they can play Beethoven before 2,000 people and do it really, really well. And so therefore, the only way they've been able to explain that is, well, it helps you attract mates, but 5-year-olds are not interested in attracting mates. And therefore, and we know there are genes that are involved in that because music is in families, partially because if I'm a musician, I'm going to encourage my children to be musicians as well. But on the other hand, we know genes are part of the ability to be able to play the piano and any musical instrument as well as other things. And so that's what I cover. I've always been interested in that. I've collected hundreds of books about people who have phenomenal abilities, and they're just discovered when they're really young. And they have people who graduate from college with a degree in medicine when they're 7 or 9 or 12. And so therefore, how can these people do that? Well, that's what I've had an interest in doing. And there are quite a few people that have done really well academically when they're quite young. And they get their PhD when they're 14. And so how do they have these skills to do mathematics and etc. Right. Now that's what I cover in the article. That article, by the way, is a summary of a book I wrote. And the publisher said, you got to cut it down to 20 pages. And I think I got it down to 15 or 16. I had a lot of idiot savants in there, and I just took all those out. That's another article. So that's what I found.
Well, I appreciate that, Dr. Bergman. I've got, for the audience, I've got the article, or the technical article here in Answers Research Journal for people to check out. I appreciate that response. As I always say, you know, it's 2022. It's a great time to be a biblical creationist. The evidence really is overwhelmingly on our side. And as you've demonstrated now for a second time here, Jerry, it is not on the side of the evolution story, a lot of fanciful storytelling. So again, Jerry, I really want to thank you for the, go ahead.
One quick thing. I submitted that to one journal, they turned it down, and they said the reason was you don't offer any evolutionary explanation for how these abilities developed. And so I looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find any viable evolutionary explanation except it helps you find mates. It's the only thing I found. They really have no idea how indeed we could evolve these phenomenal abilities. And so in the second, fortunately, the second article, the second journal I sent it to, they didn't demand that particular concern, and so therefore they accepted it. They published it without having me look again for, you know, there just is no argument out there for evolutionists to claim that. They admit, yeah, these are phenomenal, and if we don't understand how they develop, but they must have through evolution, and that's all we can say. And so that was the end of the claims.
I'm really glad you pointed that out, because, you know, I've spent a lot of time reading these technical papers as well, as it pertains to a lot of the essential functional roles in terms of the physiology and just healthy life processes in the cell, in what evolution look to as like junk sequences. And I find it kind of humorous, because when you get to like the discussion portion of these papers or the conclusions, as you pointed out, they don't give any viable empirical reasons why we should believe these functional roles, as you're pointing out, these organs, these skills, these talents have evolved naturalistically. It's just a lot of times they'll say things like, you know, engines of evolution, or you know, selective pressures, mating. These aren't answers, you know, the evolutionists are providing.
It's true.
Yeah, it's true. So I appreciate all the work you're doing, Jerry. I highly recommend your articles, your books. You're very comprehensive, knowledgeable, and yeah,
My new one just came out, The 3 Pillars of Evolution Demolished. And what I do is take the 3 pillars, and if any one of them are demolished, evolution falls. And I demolish from the literature, scientific literature, I demolished all 3 of them. And the 3 pillars are mutations, abiogenesis, and natural selection. And I show all of those fail in supporting evolution. So the pillars are gone, and therefore evolution falls. And my next book, which just came out actually yesterday, is called The Last Pillars of Darwinian Evolution Falsified. And I take all the other pillars. This is from Amazon. I don't have a copy of the book yet. This is from Amazon, and I point out all the other pillars they use, like homology, have also been demolished. And so evolution doesn't have a leg to stand on, literally.
Well, I love it. I love it. That's awesome. Nice looking books there, Jerry. I love the work you do, and it looks like I will be personally placing another order for those books. And again, to the live audience, please check out the relevant links in the description box so you can get yourself a copy as well. Again, Jerry, it's a privilege. It's an honor. Thank you so much. Time flies by. It's been an hour and a half, so I do appreciate your time. Any final words, final thoughts from you before we close down the show?
Just as I do more and more research in this area, it really is embarrassing that people could actually believe that we evolved from apes, that evolution is true. It's embarrassing. You wonder how in the world they could accept something that is so overwhelmingly false. And I guess I find it very rewarding to do this research, because over and over and over again, I find the peer-reviewed literature supports my position, and that's rewarding. It's kind of like I'm looking for gems and I find them. They're out there. And so I find that very rewarding to do, and I come up with one idea after another, and I can anticipate what I'm going to find. I may be surprised someday, but so far I haven't. I find it supports the creation worldview, and it's just very rewarding to do so. It's nice to start a building and it works, build it up and it looks good and you're done, and you know you can build it up and you know it's going to look good when you're done. So therefore I find it very rewarding. to do this work. So my wife wonders why I spend so much time proving something which is so obviously true. Well, it's just, why not? It's just, I got the house done and now I want to build a porch and let's see what the porch looks like. And so I just keep on working, and I'm doing now the effective evolution on Holocaust, including Rwanda. And I'm finding behind it was, again, Darwinism. And that's very clearly there in the literature. And I found it, and I'm just doing the article now, showing indeed that that was central in the Holocaust that occurred in Rwanda, killing about, what, about over a million people. And 1.7 million, I think they estimate. And so, and Darwin's right at the center of it. And it's very clear from the literature that there is Darwin. Now, there are other things involved as well, of course. There always are. But on the other hand, I find Darwinism brought over by the Germans and the Belgians. And they introduced this idea to the Rwandan people, and they end up with the idea that there's inferior and superior people, and therefore one group thought the other was inferior and killed, the Tutsis killed about 1.7 million, I think, of them. No one knows the number, but it's huge. And so here we go again, the harm that Darwinism has done in society. And all those people had to die for no reason in this poor African, beautiful African country, I should mention. Because the Belgians, basically, they said one group there were more evolved than the other group. And they were the ones that instilled in the people that idea. And so therefore they took that idea in the Holocaust in that country, and it killed those that they thought were less evolved, basically. So it's more complex than that, but it boils down to that. So that's a article I'm working on now.
Well, that's great. I appreciate, again, Jerry, all the work you're doing. It really is sad, the ripple effect that an evolutionary mindset and worldview can lead to. And you said it perfectly. You know, you go into this work, into this study, looking for gems, looking for treasure. And that's exactly what you find, brother. So again, thank you so much. Hopefully we can have you on again for another one of these many fantastic presentations and topics that you've been talking about now as well. So again, Dr. Bergman, thank you so much. To the audience, thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the awesome questions. And please share this content around. The truth is so important. Standing for truth is out.